Good morning. My name is Suzanne Kelly. I'm a member of the Social Justice Ministry team. We build the social justice forums around a common theme, and this program year, our theme is investing in each other's future. Through these forums, we aim to learn about opportunities for engagement and action to help Westminster members ensure that all neighbors thrive. We want to better understand the structures and the systems that have failed many of our neighbors. We want to explore ways we can work together to build better outcomes and to respond to Krista Tippett's charge from our opening joint forum, Who Will We Be for Each Other? Today we're very pleased to welcome AsaleSol Young, Executive Director of Urban Homeworks, speaking on hope for housing. Urban Homeworks uses equitable, dignified housing as a platform to combat racial wealth gaps and to create broader social change. Most rental and home ownership projects are in North Minneapolis and in the Frogtown neighborhood of St. Paul. AsaleSol is a graduate of Carleton College and worked with Teach for America, Project Success, and the Northside Achievement Zone before joining Urban Homeworks in 2017, beginning as a grant manager and then interim director and becoming executive director in March of 2021. Before we get started, just a couple of items. For those attending in person, please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring the microphone to you so that everyone on the live stream can hear your question or your comment. For those attending on the live stream, please submit your comment or question in the live stream chat, and we will monitor that and raise your questions or comment. With that, please welcome AsaleSol Young.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Suzanne. And thank you all so much for inviting Urban Homeworks to be with you this morning. Urban Homeworks has been working in affordable, dignified housing for 27 years. That's 27 years of fighting to perpetuate the hope of Jesus Christ through innovative community development. 27 years of working to work within marginalized and historically oppressed communities to create solutions in partnership with those communities, being guided by those communities, and working towards stability, equity, and dignity in housing. We've been working for 27 years to understand the complexities of systemic oppression and the disparities within housing and the root causes, which have led to some communities having free access to grow their wealth, access to consistent stability and needs being met, while other communities have experienced deep disinvestment from the government, from our systems, that leads to high rates of instability, leads to dilapidated neighborhoods and housing, leading to houselessness, lack of access to health care, to quality education, and ultimately denies folks the ability to live thriving lives. For Urban Homeworks, housing is just the foundation of survival. It is a gateway, a doorway to accessing the things that bring us joy, that bring us peace, and ultimately allow us to thrive. And so in 27 years, we recognize that there is still more work to be done. When I was a child, I was incredibly rigorous in my study of the Bible. I was also incredibly rigorous in my study of African American history, of colonization, of understanding what led to the disparities that we witness today. And as a young person, what I was often most excited about in my Bible study were the stories of Jesus Christ going into the temples and holding temple priests accountable for their perpetual greed and their engineering of social injustice that was leading to the disparities of that era. Those stories were examples of the few times in which Christ actually demonstrated how his love was manifest through an anger, through a rage of inequity, holding accountable the folks that were creating that inequity. And that inspired me as a young person, in particular as a young person who had been studying historic injustice in this country. It's powerful to witness a model of what love can look like and the partnership of love and justice. As a society today, we continue to demonstrate our own perpetual search for excess, our own inability to ensure that all of the nations that exist in this country have access to the things that we need. And as a faith-based institution modeled after the life of Jesus Christ, we are consistently questioning the impact of housing as a commodity, housing as seen as a tool for wealth building. So in our reflections, we work to we really work to understand the model that was left for us and how we can use housing to perpetuate that love. And so what I'm going to do today is spend some time just kind of talking about what we see in society today, what has gotten us to this place of deep need, and the work that we are doing as an organization to lean into that love and activism, that model that was left for us by Jesus Christ. So quickly, context setting, again, so that we have shared awareness, shared understanding in this room together today. When we look at the numbers nationally, we see that within black communities, black folks' income on average is just 60% of white incomes nationally. What this looks like in terms of long-term wealth, generational wealth, is that black folks hold just 14% of the wealth that white folks have accumulated nationally over time. And what we understand is that housing is often, it is not the only marker, but it is a large contributor to this wealth gap. So one of the things that is important to recognize is simply the history of housing in this country. So what we know is that in 1935, the government created this program that gave us access to the concept of a 30-year mortgage and being able to take out a loan in order to achieve housing stability and housing ownership for your family. Now, in 1935, a lot of folks were not allowed access to those programs. And the government created a concept called redlining, where they would take a map, and some of you might know this already, but again, I want to give us a baseline of understanding in the room. But they would create maps that prioritize certain communities and particularly certain demographics in those communities. So if you were living in a predominantly white community just by chance, that was considered a green neighborhood, a neighborhood that would achieve economic growth, an ideal place to live, likely good schools, good access to clean water, food, things like that. Red neighborhoods were those that were predominantly African American. And then yellow was usually neighborhoods that were in between those, or neighborhoods that they were starting to see an integration of people choosing on their own to come together. The government would say that because there are black and brown folks in that neighborhood is, we predict, will eventually become a redlined neighborhood. So the government set up a system that put in our mindset, just as regular people, that we needed to be wary of black and brown folks coming into our neighborhoods. So even though this isn't on this slide, it's important to understand what got us to 1968. So in 1968, the government was willing to reflect and say, wait a minute, we have been contributing to housing discrimination, and so we're going to do what we can to shift the market implications. And so they created the Fair Housing Act, which gave more access to black and brown families to move into more communities. The key issue here is that by 1968, again, going from 1935 to 1968, where in 1935, you could buy a home for probably 2 times your salary. By 1968, the cost of homes had already reached 6 to 8 times the average income. And remember that access to high-quality, well-paying jobs was still limited for Black and brown residents. So that gap is even more significant. And so something that I really like to point out to people in conversations about housing injustice is that the beauty of our Constitution is that it had already outlawed discrimination. But when the government started to enact these programs, it was contradicting our constitutional rights. And I just think that that's something important for folks to recognize, right? We have the Fifth Amendment, which on the federal level says that we have to treat everyone equally in this country. The 14th Amendment says that now we're going from the federal level to the state and local level. We still have to treat folks equally in this country. And of course, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and this notion of second-class citizenry in this country. And so when you have institutions like redlining and restrictive deeds, you are reversing the power of the Constitution, what the Constitution saw as the future of equity in this country. So this is just a quick notes to help you understand kind of where we came from pre-1968, so starting 1935, and how things shifted or did not shift in 1968. So you still had exclusionary zoning, predatory lenders, state-led disinvestment, which again kind of follows that redlining pattern of thinking that we are going to put less resources in redlined communities. That leads to gentrification. A common practice back then was to encourage Black families to move, or often to encourage white families out of fear to leave their neighborhoods. So let's go back to that original example of green, yellow, and red. If you were living in a yellow community, you might have someone knock on your door and say, you might want to move. You might want to sell your home because the rate of Black and brown families moving into this community is increasing, which means they would say to you, the value of your home will decline. So I think it's important, again, to note that this wasn't a pattern that was witnessed and then named. This was something that was named and then manifested from people's actions, believing what people would tell them about Black and brown folks moving into their communities. Is it okay to... Okay. Got you. That's okay.
It's just about the information. The Fair Housing Act, then it seems like what's being described is that it failed in the very regards that it was claiming to be addressing. Is that simple and pretty fair? Because that's what it looks like.
Yes, I would
based
say
on the
that
data.
is fair.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's important just to recognize that it failed because of everything that had gone into it prior. And the mindset that had now been established, which meant that cities didn't hesitate to enact exclusionary zoning. Banks didn't hesitate to practice discriminatory lending, right? And I just think it's really important to understand how like collective social mindsets can shift based on what's coming out of the government. So this leads us to where we are at today. Minnesota has remained in the top 5 for racial disparities in both housing and education. Typically, we're somewhere in the top 3. This year, 2020, we landed at 4th, so we had slight improvement. What feels even more important to me is that the Twin Cities is currently considered number 1 for racial disparities in housing of any metro region in the United States. And I'm just going to repeat that. Number 1 for racial disparities in any metropolitan area in the United States. So when I think about that and I take that in, I'm really thinking about the states in this country. And my brain is moving down south, and my brain is saying, we're doing worse than southern states that have a history of slavery and Jim Crow. The Twin Cities are currently doing worse than any of those southern cities in housing disparities. Yeah, so I think that, the reasons are nationally already indicated, but specifically for Minneapolis, it is about recognizing what are the tools that are needed to counter that history that I just walked through, which is impacting all cities in the United States. What we see is that, from this slide, that while white home ownership has increased and then plateaued over time, leaving folks at just under 80% ownership within white community, for black folks, it's gotten worse. And we are sitting at less than 30% of home ownership in black communities in the United States. To more directly answer your question, we need to apply solutions that recognize the disinvestment and recognize the income gaps in the Twin Cities.
So are we socially lazy compared to those other metropolitan areas because we haven't done anything to pull ourselves out of that yuck state? Is that?
I wouldn't personally use the word lazy. I would say that, one of the things I used to talk about when I did this presentation was about how it wasn't long ago that we voted to build a brand new Viking stadium. The cost that went into that build could have put a lot of people into home ownership. So we are actively choosing here to invest elsewhere instead of into our neighbors, to the point of even why you all have these talks, right? Which is, how can we support our neighbors? Voting matters, and when we make decisions like that, the impact looks like this.
I guess I was kind of wondering more about micro reasons. Home ownership here, homes are extremely expensive
Yes.
in this area compared to a lot of other areas. So does that contribute to it?
Yeah,
Do we
absolutely.
have a higher percentage of black and brown compared to other major cities? Does that contribute to it?
I would say absolutely not.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Right,
that's what
yeah.
I'm saying. I'm wondering about these micro reasons.
Yes, no, I think that that's a great question. Let's take Memphis, Tennessee. Their black and brown population is much higher than ours here. New York City, places that we all recognize have more diverse populations are doing better than we are here. But again, to your point, incomes are not catching the rate of increase as the housing market is growing. And that impacts black and brown families at a higher level than white families. And so if we are unwilling to say we are creating opportunities for folks with lower incomes, when we know the incomes are not being raised at the rate of the market, we have to be willing to say we see that, and we're willing to create programming that allows lower income families to move into ownership. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about some of the ways Urban Homeworks is doing that. But these are just other ways to, we all kind of take in data differently, so I like to just give people a couple different examples here. Of what that looks like. And then finally, just recognizing what's happening in the world of lending. If some of you will remember how earlier this year an article was written about Wells Fargo's lending practices. And the data that the article was referencing was from 2020, so it was fairly recent. And what they found was that nationally, Wells Fargo was approving mortgages and refinancing for black families at a rate of 47%, while white families were experiencing approval rates around 72%. Now, for those of you that didn't get a chance to read the article, you might be thinking, well, if white incomes are far outpacing black and brown incomes, then this is a financial situation that Wells Fargo was very much making a decision based on risk, financial risk. The article dug in and found that for Black and brown families making near $200,000 a year, their acceptance rate was significantly lower than white families making just around $60,000 a year. So we cannot blame economics. We cannot blame risk, financial risk. This is clearly a racial issue. So what are we doing about it? 27 years into this fight, and we are still going strong. As we look at this data, we have to start asking the same questions that I hope that all of us will ask going forward, which is, what do we need to do to create deep affordability for our low-income families? So at Urban Homeworks, I talked about our mission at the beginning to perpetuate the hope of Jesus Christ through innovative community development. Our vision is neighbors raising their collective voice to address injustice and overcome the barriers that perpetuate inequity. Ultimately, we see housing as a platform to create social change right here in the Twin Cities and Minnesota at large.
I would like to mention one other way that racism comes in. I know 2 Black families that once they got to closing had to suddenly pony up more money. You know, once they recognized this was a Black family. So again, they're expecting more. They're really worried about a risk there, but it's the Black family then that has to. And that was true of Alika, you know, our pastor in North Minneapolis.
Yeah, so I mean, to your point, we have individual racism, microaggressions at play in the midst of systemic oppression, right? Like what Wells Fargo has been able to do is actually a systemic issue that is empowered by individual mindsets. So at Urban Homeworks, we have 4 primary programs: real estate development, equity and engagement, dignified rentals, and volunteering. The biggest aspect of our work is in real estate development. That is where we do the work of creating and renovating homes for affordable ownership, for affordable sale. Typically, we're selling single-family homes at 80% of the area median income. So area median income is based on counties, and in the Hennepin County, the AMI for a family of 4 is $114,000. That's the area median. So that means, of course, you have families on the higher end of that and on the lower end. 80% of that puts a family of 4 around $80,000, a little less than $80,000. So that's typically what we do in home ownership. Given what we were just talking about, as we move forward in our next 27 years, it is about creating opportunities for families making significantly less than 80% of the area median income. Our equity engagement program is the heart of our work. It's where we really connect with our residents, we connect with our neighbors, and understand exactly what is happening in communities, and understand exactly what is needed, being led by those communities so that we are supporting the initiatives that they believe in as pathways to solutions for the issue. Dignified rentals are how we started, and so we have 136 units of rental housing where we're housing nearly 500 people, mostly families. And then our volunteer program, which is the way to kind of connect, get involved. Historically, it has focused on bringing folks outside of the community into these communities, but now moving forward, it's really about bridging that gap, that human gap, and bringing folks from the community to partner with folks from outside of the community. So I talked a little bit about these numbers already. These are the number of homes that we've sold, and those demographics are very similar to our rental numbers. We sell our homes primarily to Black and brown families, 63% having children, nearly 60% female-led households. And our rental units look very similar. So when I talk about being willing to recognize what's actually at stake and apply solutions to meet the problem where it's at, we started in Phillips in South Minneapolis, where today you have nearly 50% of the residents making less than $35,000 a year. In Central neighborhood, close to 35% making $35,000 a year. And in North Minneapolis, 41% making less than $35,000 a year. So 80% AMI is not affordable for the majority of people living in these communities. And so what that means for our work in building deeper affordability is that we have to be willing to create unique solutions and bring them together with things we've seen in the past, things like the cooperative housing model, things like land trust, which ensures that regardless of who purchases or sells a home, it remains affordable because the land ultimately stays with the community and is stewarded rather than owned by those who move into those spaces. And so those are initiatives that we're working on right now, where we are combining the affordability of cooperative living, which is essentially like living in a condo. It's shared expenses, right, for the overhead of the building, and pairing that with land trust so that, again, there's a significant percentage of the cost of the home that stays with the community so that each new buyer doesn't have to come up with that funding. As we move forward in partnership with folks like you all, organizations and congregations that are inviting us in, we recognize that to create systemic change, we do have to be led by those that are experiencing the deepest oppression. But systemic change will not occur if folks outside of that oppression, folks that are privileged or are benefiting from that oppression, do not join with us. It will not happen. And when we look at history, and like I said, I'm a student of Black liberation movements. When we look at the civil rights movement, you recognize that the people had to demand the justice that the government was then willing to write into law. And we recognize that today. These are the values that guide our work. They are very much intended to recognize where we have come from as an organization and the era that we are in collectively as a society, recognizing that if we do not name racism as the cause for these problems, we will not solve them. We have to tell the truth, and we have to actively work against that kind of systemic oppression. Grit, I like to just share that really that comes from being inspired by those freedom fighters, those justice fighters that came before us. The work is exhausting, and we have to be relentless. And so remembering what they went through helps to keep us going. And so what guides our work? I started this presentation talking about myself as a young person, learning and figuring out what kind of human I wanted to be in the world. And I was so blessed to be raised in a household where the concept of agape love was lifted up in my home, and that was the thing that I was raised to strive toward. Understanding that, as a meek human, agape love, right, is probably not possible, but that was kind of like what you work towards, to love in that way, that higher love. And that higher love included the fight for justice, the fight for those that didn't have the same access, didn't have the same voice, to not leave anyone behind. And I feel so blessed by that upbringing, and that really is what guides the work of Urban Homeworks. That, again, given the model of Jesus Christ, if we were to take the easy route, we would not be living into our mission. We would not be living into that model. And so our work is really to invite others to join us in living that model and living justice out loud, or as Cornel West likes to say, justice is what love looks like in public. For those of you who do not know, Cornel West is a scholar of African American history, and he's also a Christian. So when I hear that, justice is what love looks like in public, he is channeling that model, that same model that we are channeling. So as we move into questions, I know that folks will have questions for me. I want to leave you with this question, which is, how do you understand living justice? How do you understand living or walking a life of love, living your faith through activism and through justice? Things we can do together. There's that scary word up there, reparations, which in my experience has caused very different reactions from different groups of people. But what's important to point out when we boldly put words like that on a slide is to recognize that, going back to that data I shared earlier, where across the nation black families hold just 14% of the wealth that white families hold, without drastic action, that gap not only stays the same, but it grows, right? Without drastic change, the gap gets worse. And we find that in 27 years from now, it won't be my face, but another face will be standing here talking about the same thing. Decommodifying housing. So, you all, we are in fall. We're quickly moving toward winter. My heart always thinks about the tent encampments that we often see, thinks about those houseless as we get closer to our deep cold that we experience here in Minnesota. If we do not figure out how to decommodify housing, which means that we are thinking about how to remove this notion that housing is simply a tool to grow wealth. To decommodify it means that we recognize that it is a part of a basic human right for survival. Then nothing will change, and those folks that are houseless in this very cold place will continue to be that way. So how do we avoid that? Shared ownership models, as I just spoke about earlier. Partnerships with the land trust so that a home stays affordable into perpetuity regardless of who owns it. Cooperative models, which a lot of times people do fear, but we have a model similar that people accept, which is the condo model. The difference between a co-op and a condo is that you do not have like a board in a condo, that the folks that live in that cooperative are the board, and you make those decisions together. And expanding our zoning to include accessory dwelling units, which actually Suzanne and I were just talking about right before this talk started, and the opportunity that provides for an individual landowner to say, I have my house, but I have all of this land behind my home that I am not using. My kids have moved out. And now that I finally have access to sound, questions, I'll turn it over to you all. I'm going to come get closer to you.
Is it okay if I go ahead and ask my question while you're relocating?
Absolutely.
Relocating. That was a house pun. You talked, I'm always very curious about what I can do as an individual. And you talked about the stadium and that obviously people in the community voted for that. Is there anything coming up in the upcoming election that that we should be aware of and make sure that we vote on?
I would say not in our local elections, but things to keep on the radar are, the mayor's 2030 plan, and really making sure that we are following that plan, because it's actually a pretty good plan. But if we don't follow it, then no matter how well it's written, it doesn't matter. And so being willing to hold the city accountable to that plan, And then the other thing that is the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul are both considering, right, is rent stabilization methods. And so remembering that all the data, there's a lot of data out there about the impact of rent stabilization. But if we prioritize excess, wealth gain over individual need and humanity, then those arguments will always say that that move, rent stabilization, compromises access to wealth building. It will always say that. But we need to make that decision because we want to prioritize our neighbors, and we want to live in a humane community that gets out of that #1 spot of gap in this city.
I just wanted to have you clarify what you, I mean, I didn't hear it well, I guess. I can't even remember what it sounded like. It sounded like it was a policy that we have, but we're ignoring.
Oh, no, I was just speaking to the mayor's 2030 plan,
Okay, what's that?
which Mayor Fry
Oh, okay.
ran on that essentially, and outlines kind of how he sees creating more housing stability and equity, among other things, in the city of Minneapolis.
So I guess a word of caution to watch the city councils, even on the local level. I would be monitoring your city councils. I just got a flyer on our door. The two candidates, we live in New Brighton, a first-ring suburb, and these two candidates were upset and going to vote against any further multi-family housing or multi-unit housing. There's too much of it going on in the Twin Cities and in New Brighton, as they claim, and they will fight that. And that's the absolute opposite of what we need to be doing. We need to be integrating our neighborhoods in types of housing, because those mixed of housing builds up the neighborhood. So anyway, sorry.
No, absolutely, that's a great point. And zoning, which that would be a zoning issue in Minneapolis for sure, is something to keep an eye on as well. You know, we have a lot of zoning that says that in certain communities you cannot even build multifamily units, which pushes folks out and leads to increased houselessness. Do we have any questions from the folks in social media or? Okay.
How do we establish land trust? Who's responsible for that, and how does that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the Twin Cities, we have 2 land trust organizations. We have the City of Lakes Community Land Trust, which primarily works in Minneapolis and Hennepin County. And in St. Paul, we have the Rondo Community Land Trust, which works in Ramsey and St. Paul. And so they already exist. And depending on where you own your home, depending on where you own your home, you could opt to sell to a community land trust, which would, again, contribute to long-term affordability.
So where do they get their funding from?
They fundraise like we do.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm very impressed with you and Urban, I was going to say your organization, but I'm sure there are others, Urban Homeworks. I'm wondering, could you give us some idea of the breakdown in your income budget and expense, and just thinking like approximately how much comes from churches, other, I just like, are you actively writing grants and that are successful and so forth?
Absolutely.
And how can we plug into it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. And I do wish at this moment that I had our development director here to give you precise numbers, but I'll do my best. So we run on about a $5 million budget, and you have to remember that we own property. So a significant portion of that $5 million is actually just capital. It's not cash. We have 136 units of rental housing, and the cost to maintain that housing to a dignified standard is exorbitant. We try to keep our rents stable. We have not, on some of our units, we have not raised rent for 10 years, which means that they are deeply affordable. And we're learning that, we have to start to raise rent in order to cash flow those buildings, to keep them up to date. So that's one aspect of just like how our organization operates and the cash flow there. We do government contracts on our single-family development for 80% of the area median income. So a lot of that funding comes from those government contracts, where the government helps us close what we call the equity gap between the fact that we have to buy materials, buy labor at market rate, but then we're saying we're going to turn it around and sell at an affordable rate. If we don't have government subsidy or contributions from foundations and things like that, that would continue to drive us into the red, and then we wouldn't be able to operate. So then on the other side of our income stream is foundations, it's grant funding, it's individual donations, and that makes up about $2 million, $2 to $2.5 million of our budget is individuals, foundations, and congregations saying they want to contribute to the mission. Did I answer the question? Okay. I can definitely put you in touch with my development director also to get a more precise answer.
The difference between wealth, the folks that have wealth and those that don't. And then I was later in your presentation thinking about the cooperative model, whether that, have you figured out that that's sustainable? And what I mean by that, are people okay in the long run going with that model for living, or do you find that they want to, I'll say, see, this is how I'm going to come around, aspire to the traditional American model? Well, this was fine for now, but now I want to own a house of my own, because there's a constant tension in our world between this idea that you own a home as equity to make money, to have an asset, blah, 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 so you can pass it on or whatever. And then that other model of why you have a home. And unless we can shift that, we're not, the cooperative model won't, well, I'm just asking, is the cooperative model sustainable, have you seen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that a lot of folks are wrestling with. So what we have found is that in the cooperative model, the ask of the owner is significantly reduced, the financial ask. And so in a market rate home, you have 20% down payment that you're being asked for up front. In the communities that we work in, that is not reasonable. And so the cooperative model asks for a much smaller percentage for families to produce up front. And anything that they put into that home will come back to them at sale if they choose to. So the way I like to talk about the economics of cooperative versus mainstream is that if you are a mainstream buyer, you have had access to savings. Sometimes you've had access to generational wealth where like a parent or a grandparent helps you buy a home. And so you're able to compete in the market. Folks that don't have that access haven't been able to build their savings, let alone consider investment of any kind. And so they're really trying to figure out living just beyond paycheck to paycheck. How can I save just enough so that I can put down any kind of down payment? And so what happens when you move into a cooperative unit is that now you are able to start to build some more significant savings over time, so that a lot of people do move out of that cooperative space into the mainstream housing market. And some folks stay. It really will depend on that point of entry and their career trajectory. What is their access to growing their income? As their family grows, what access do the children have, and things like that. So some folks do stay, and when they pass on, again, because it's a land trust owned home, that home stays affordable for the community, but also their children can buy it as a part of the cooperative as well.
That we shouldn't necessarily, how can we not continue to hold that the cooperative model is just the first step and it's not good enough? Because in our society, it can be just fine. I will just give by testimony. We live in townhomes that we are self-managed townhomes. So we are the board, we are the board of directors. So, you know, and we're fine and it works, but that's not what we have as the national thinking about what having a home means. So.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I think that it is about changing the narrative so that folks understand the benefit of the community that's created in a cooperative home, and the way that people work together. What I value about that is it really takes us back to a time before capitalism kind of ran our society, when we were more willing, all of us, of all racial backgrounds, to live more collectively and cooperatively with each other. So if your roof has a hole in it in a cooperative model, everyone supports you, and you don't have to just figure that out by yourself. I will just say, in terms of the economics, for the project that Urban Homeworks is currently working on, we are working on a cooperative land trust project in partnership with the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. And because we're seeking deep affordability, both that organization, Blue, and Urban Homeworks are putting money towards folks being sustainable. And so when folks move into those homes, they'll have a reserve that we will have started for them that they'll then be responsible to contribute to. But that reserve is intended so that after 10, 15 years, when these brand new homes might start to show things here and there that need to be redone, they will have a pool of money already set aside for them. And we fundraise for that. Another thing that we're doing as an organization is building a reserve to provide folks, particularly Black and brown folks from a particular income level, with down payment support, not as a loan, but as a grant. And so in 2023, we are looking to give 10 families $20,000 of just free money towards their down payment. And that money, to your question, is fundraised. We go to donors that have a passion for closing that gap, and they help us create that pool of money.
We only have time for a couple more questions, and we'll take them from the chat.
Got you.
Thank you. On behalf of those on the chat, they were wondering if you can speak about the multi-unit apartment building surge that we're having, and what impact does that have on affordable home ownership or access to affordable housing? Because the way that is proceeding, you know, isn't necessarily with affordability in mind.
Yes. So one of the things that we're seeing in the city right now, to your point, to that individual's point, is that we are building more multi-unit housing, rental housing, I assume we're talking about in particular, for high-income folks. And we do have a lot of high-income folks in the Twin Cities. The reality, though, is that they are not filling these high-income units. And so what that is doing is it's furthering the shortage of affordable housing in the Twin Cities when we're spending money developing for folks that are not going to either move in because there aren't quite as many of them, or folks that simply are transient. You know, they'll come work for Amazon, a temporary placement, a couple of years, and then they move on to another city. And so it makes our city just less sustainable. Do we have time for one more, or are we done? One more?
Thank you, AsaleSol, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us today. Next Sunday, we will welcome a panel of Westminster High School students moderated by Pastor Alexandra Jacobs, sharing their experiences and reflections on the recent mission trip to Appalachia. We look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.